So I woke up this morning to a tag alert on Twitter to this particular article that was pointing to Crimson Desert, a game that is being developed by Pearl Abyss. Shout out to Raging Art for actually tagging me on this particular article, and also to some of the other folk here in the community who were pointing out what was going on. Mohammed, you were, and William, you were keeping me in the loop in terms of other outlets actually covering it. I decided to wait a little bit. One thing about a story like this, ladies and gentlemen, is it honestly is almost too good to be true, because it's somewhat, would I say somewhat? I think it explicitly confirms a lot of what I've actually been saying in the last few months. So what my premise simply is kind of exactly what we're seeing right now. A lot of third-party publishers are going to wake up to the fact that they cannot stay sustainable with exclusivity. This particular report on translation shows that Crimson Desert's developer Pearl Abyss was approached by PlayStation to try to get an exclusivity deal. The words were actually put together in a detailed blog written by someone where, if you translate it, the translations have been confirmed to be correct. It talks a lot about the project and, some of the comments that they were actually, that were shared, and the engine limitations, a lot of insight about it. Actually, there's a lot of information here, and I would love to go back and read through it on my own just to kind of get a glimpse of what their development strategies and marketing strategies are. But here is the crux of the matter. They said we were also offered an exclusive contract, in parentheses, with conditions such as a ban on Xbox release for a certain period of time from Sony. But we decided to proceed with self-publishing as we judged that self-publishing would yield higher expected profits. Now, when you talk about expected profits, I wonder where we've heard lower expected profitability from going exclusive with PlayStation. Yes, the exact answer is correct. You know exactly what I'm about to talk about. Those of you who've been watching for a long time, it's Final Fantasy. Square Enix put their games, Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7, 3 parts, the base, integrate, and rebirth, all on PlayStation. Since then, we've seen from their financial statements that they have not necessarily met satisfying profitability. I've made the video about this game, made the video about Stellar Blade, and possibly any other game that's going to get Moneyhatted by PlayStation without a contingency. These games are eating slop in terms of sales. Why? Because imagine a world where Final Fantasy, having existed for many years as an established IP, is getting raked upon the coals by a game where you run around a mountain as a Monkey King with a stick and beat other creatures. Yes, that's the world we're living in. You see, Final Fantasy, you could probably call it quality or whatever it is, but honestly, that game is mechanically sound in its iterations. It has a lot in terms of audiences, but just the fact that over time, Square Enix has gotten in bed with PlayStation and has kept the game away from its core audiences for many years, I can say that people have decided that they're not going to be interested in Final Fantasy regardless of what it is you try to serve them. The developers over at, Pearl Abyss, I think, are smart. They've looked at the writing on the wall. Right now, I told y'all that another Korean developer did the exact opposite. Even though they had a deal with Xbox, they made their way into the ecosystem Game Pass, and at the same time were able to still go multi-plat. In that regard, their games brand is actually much more stronger than Stellar Blade. Why? They have a following. There's already confirmation that they're making and working on a sequel, because that sequel is not just going to be one in isolation. It's going to be received by the fans who received their first game gladly. This one thing that Stellar Blade is missing. Final Fantasy 16 has also gone out there to test out what the fan base will do after having been delayed, and they've seen that the PC sales and those fans on other platforms that they were probably expecting to come through did not really show up. We've seen at least 50 minutes of Crimson Desert's gameplay. If you haven't watched it yet, please take some time to go watch it. I think the game looks interesting. I'll have to wait for more. However, with Final Fantasy 16, when you look at the Steam database, you'll realize that right now the game probably has been a big failure on the PC side compared to, and when I say failure, I'm not talking about, oh, the game failed. I'm saying compared to what its potential could yield if, say, this was a day one launch on the PC platform. Like I said, can you imagine a world where a Monkey King game, where you're going and running around in the mountains, beating other animals with a stick, is basically, in a sense, 5, 10, almost maybe in some cases 15xing your peak players on Steam. This is not a good outlook. I think Pearl Abyss may have just dodged a bullet. For the longest time, it was sworn by the so-called PlayStation fans that PlayStation had sold more consoles than Xbox, that this was pretty much the only metric that you needed to know who, in quote, won the console war. Not knowing that PlayStation pretty much has focused and set its sights, for the most part, on third-party games. This is something that in the 360 days, according to some of you, was kind of kicked off by Xbox. Whoever kicked it off, I don't care. They were pretty much dirtbags for doing it. And I think what probably killed Xbox, if they were doing this in the 360 days and looking successful for it, was because they were basically, depending on these third-party games to carry their studios. Then in the Xbox One and PS4 days, after PlayStation had eventually invested in its own studios, PlayStation was able to launch the continuation of the Uncharted trilogy, the continuation of the God of War franchise, and then drop the Spider-Man franchise, that being under PlayStation's wing. Then The Last of Us was able to, continue, and Sucker Punch. All these, their PlayStation studios brought some really heavy hitters and much more in the PlayStation 4 days. At this point, Xbox was pretty much bankrupt with any games that could come out of their own ecosystems. So the money hatting, as PlayStation dived more deeper in the PS4 days to continue to harm Xbox, they've now come on the PS5 days, and the whole thing has come back to roost, a repetition of history, where they're not focusing on their own studios games, but rather have focused on these third-party exclusive deals. And if this story is true, it seems like right now they're being exposed for exactly what kind of company they actually are. A company that doesn't seemingly trust in its own development process, or at least is not confident enough that its own development process can actually win, because it spends so much time in dealing with all of these other games to money hat them. And honestly, I think that's been the biggest problem. I've been saying this for the last few months, and some folk have come out to say, well, consumers don't really care except unless where the game is actually being made or who makes the game. All they care is where they can actually play the game. That's a very interesting cop-out at the end of the day. It just shows to me that a lot of PlayStation fans are for this kind of business practice, and they don't necessarily see how they're pretty much being cheated out of games that they would have gotten anyways in terms of this particular conversation. So PlayStation was going to spend money to get you a game that you were going to get, but it wanted to pretty much block the game from going to another platform to make it seem like that platform was not a viable platform and make itself seem much more viable than it is. And the developers pretty much said, no, we think we can be more profitable without going exclusive. If we were going to sell it to your 60 million or maybe more users, what's stopping us from trying to sell it to another 30 or so million players on the Xbox side? Smart developers. That's how you do business. I'm hoping that more developers are learning this, because, the allure after having spent investment in developing your game is that you hope somebody will come in with a guaranteed way for you to make money. I can see it from the business side. It's very appealing. But at the end of the day, your brand is at risk because you're here in the gaming business for the long term. That's how you will prove success. If you're able to stick it out for the long term and create a market, an audience, a player base that's dedicated to actually following and engaging in your product, you will have guaranteed sales. Ask From Software every single time. Ask Nintendo every single time. Ask Activision every single time. And many other titles continue to enjoy this same benefit, be they live service, be they single player. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when you drop a game. These audiences are going to be there to basically patronize you. Now, here's the thing. Like I said in the beginning of this video, I take this with a little bit of skepticism because, again, like I said, it's almost too good to be true. Now, it could be 100% true, but again, I still maintain that sometimes these stories could eventually come out and, in a sense, they could be denied. But if it's not denied at some point, then we can pretty much say, sure, we can tell that, the silence is pretty much our confirmation. But this stuff was actually put out here by people who are knowledgeable about the dealings that went on at the time. So for those of you who've been pretty much defending money hatting and who've been saying that, well, it's actually just the way business goes, have you now seen at least 2 examples of developers pretty much weighing their profitability inside one, an exclusive deal? This is Square Enix, and another looking from the outside and going, there's no way we're going to go ahead and do an exclusivity deal. And then if you look at, say, maybe even an outlier like Stellar Blade only selling about 1 million copies after all was said and done, with their game being locked down on on PlayStation now. No PC release announced yet, while PlayStation is packing its games and dumping on PC. You kind of see that PlayStation pretty much is being hypocritical. I almost think they want to stifle these other games so that these games don't, compete with their own games. I think that's pretty much what's going on here. Again, I've said it, that this just seems like a conspiracy theory, because these games have the potential to sell way more than a lot of the other PlayStation titles. Crimson Desert, PlayStation doesn't make anything like that. It's one of these open world, RPG medieval games like Dragon's Dogma, Elden Ring. I mean, it just has a category, The Witcher 3, and PlayStation has not put any of this kind of stuff out there. And so I can see how they look at this and see a viable product. But then there's also that side of me that sees PlayStation in such a devious light that I can't help but, hypothesize. And I'm not saying they're doing this, but my brain can't help but do it, because maybe I just don't trust them anymore. After all these years being a PlayStation user and seeing that they're just only here for the bag and have no value proposition, it just continues to erode my trust. And, you can't blame me, and that's pretty much my opinion on this matter. We'll probably reference it later on. Thanks so much for those of you who pointed out the article. I appreciate you guys' time and audience. Let me hear your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks once again for watching. Peace out.